I'm Victoria Ingles. I'm Senior Curator at the National Museum of the Royal Navy in Portsmouth. And I'm joined today by Mary Wills, who is an independent historian and has just written a book called Envoys of Abolition, which looked very much at the experience of sailors in the West Coast of Africa Squadron. And Mary, I know you've got a great interest in one of the artefacts that we've got in our collections here in Portsmouth, which you came across as part of your research. And it'd be nice to talk a little bit more detail about this item and how it relates to Black history. I've got the item in question here with me right now in our store. It's a carved piece of scrimshaw, but this particular one is of quite unique interest, really, because of who is mentioned in the carving. And it's hard to see, but it's Jim Freeman, head crewman. On one side, it mentions HMS Sybil with the Commodore Collier. And on the other side, Jim Freeman, head crewman of HMS Glendower, which was Commodore with Robert Mendes at the time. And I was wondering, Mary, many people probably haven't heard of the West Coast of Africa Squadron. If you could just give us a little bit of an overview as to what the squadron was and what they were doing at the time around the 1820s.
Yeah, of course, happy to. So in 1807, the British Parliament passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act, which made illegal any further British participation in the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans. To enforce the act and to suppress the continuing slave trade of other nations, a squadron of Royal Navy vessels was sent to the west coast of Africa to police the coast, effectively, to intercept slave ships and to release the enslaved Africans found on board. So throughout the 19th century, the British created a really strong naval presence along much of the coast of West Africa, roughly from what was then the British territory of Sierra Leone and as far south as what we would now know as Congo.
And what was life like for sailors who were on the squadron at the time?
Not great, it has to be said. The West Africa Squadron had a real infamous reputation among the men who served on it. This was particularly given a typical period of service was something up to 3 years of being away from home. The environment was really tough to endure. The climate was hot and debilitating. And daily life could actually be really tedious, with an awful lot of kind of idling at sea, waiting to see a slaver. Many naval officers complained of the inefficiency of the ships of the squadron, which were often easily outrun by slave ships. In particular, sickness and mortality rates were also significantly higher on stations, than other stations of the Royal Navy in this period. And this was due to the spread of tropical diseases, such as yellow fever, malaria, and other diseases. So much so that West Africa was commonly known as the white man's grave amongst serving officers there. In particular, the dangers of the coastal climate were made worse because naval personnel went out on boat service, searching rivers and inlets, attempting to intercept slavers at their embarkation points. So that's where enslaved Africans were prepared and to be forced onto ships to endure the middle passage across the Atlantic. So that really heightened instances of fever.
And moving on now to look at Jim Freeman himself, who carved the tusk that we have. What do we know about him? What was his real name? Was it Jim Freeman, do we know? And what was the role of a crewman on board?
Okay, so as we've seen at the start of this film, Jim Freeman was on Binstead's ship, the Owen Glendower. He was the owner of this said scrimshaw. The scrimshaw was intended as a gift or as a keepsake, but it was also a testimonial of service because Jim Freeman was a serving member of the crew of the Owen Glendower. And more than that, he was also the head crewman. So the crewmen were West African seamen. The West Africa Squadron relied very heavily on these West African sailors. It should be said there were various African groups who were employed aboard British ships in this period, but the most numerous by far were migrant labourers from the Crew Coast, which is now present-day Ivory Coast and Liberia. So the British depended on Africans for the day-to-day operation of their activities on the West African coast. Crew worked for colonial officials on shore in Sierra Leone and other British territories. They also worked on merchant vessels, and as we were saying, a real big number worked on the West Africa Squadron. This was mainly because a key problem facing the squadron was finding men to navigate the coastline. This was particularly the case with the high mortality rates, as we've already discussed. The crew were highly skilled mariners and were therefore, we can now say, they were integral to the Royal Navy's efforts to suppress the transatlantic slave trade in the 19th century. In fact, it's been estimated that up to 1/3 of personnel on anti-slave trade vessels were of African ancestry, which is actually a really huge number. And you're just going back to Jim Freeman as head crewman. So after several years' service afloat, a crew sailor like Jim Freeman could ascend in rank from an ordinary seaman to a petty officer or a headman. That meant that he was in charge of recruiting and managing a team of crew sailors on board, so would act as a mediator between the African workers and their employers, who were the British at the time.
That's fantastic, Mary. I'd like to thank you for joining me this afternoon to look at the scrimshaw in a little bit more detail, and hopefully people have learned a little bit more about the West Coast Africa Squadron and its sort of impact on the abolition of the slave trade.
No worries at all. Thank you.
Bye.